Hello, I'm Dr. Mary Townsend. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at St. John's in Queens, and I am teaching a course on Plato's Protagoras that meets Wednesdays from 6 to 8 p.m., January 7th through February 11th. It's a really interesting dialogue. It's one of his more difficult ones. It's one of the longer ones. But you get to see a younger Socrates engaging directly with this very famous sophist, one of the most wealthy, well-known, and successful sophists in all of ancient Greece. And they really go at it. The subject, of course, is something like, what is virtue? Protagoras claims to know what political art is, and he claims to teach it. And then of course, Socrates is not going to be satisfied with his answer. So they really, the life of the philosopher versus the life of the sophist really come to sharp contrast, maybe more so than almost any other Platonic dialogue. But the difficulty, and this will be interesting to discuss, is that part of why Socrates is able to sort of, if not persuade, then somewhat overpower his arguments by the end, is because Socrates, it's because Socrates concedes something about the relationship of virtue to pleasure, which is going to strike us as a little unsocratic. He seems to claim, or partially claim, that pleasure is a good, or maybe the good, something like this. And he gets Protagoras to realize that on that ground, courage can't be something that comes to us without knowledge. But then that's a Socratic concession that it just doesn't sound like Socrates from other dialogues. So he beats the sophist. He beats the sophist. We see the sophist in action, but we also don't see Socrates speaking about nobility in the same way that we're used to, speaking about education in the same way we're used to. So it's like all Platonic dialogues. You go in wanting something, and you are left with a feeling that you're missing something, that something very important has not been said, which is very much the point. So going into something like this, you're looking for how to deal with your own sense of disappointment while still sort of hanging on to what Socrates and Plato can teach you about this situation. So of the dialogues we have, say there's roughly 36 or so, many of them are very short. And they happen where Socrates meets up with a young person who's interested in learning in some way, and he talks to him for maybe an hour or two, and then either the person goes away or they decide to sort of like take up with Socrates' learning. But so the Protagoras is a dialogue where Socrates confronts a professional. And so someone who is more equal to him in power of arguments. And so the conversation is logically more complicated. It's simply longer, but then also is more is at stake. Socrates is speaking in a less friendly fashion, so he seems to be almost more combative, potentially, and he also has to deal with a hugely wide range of arguments in a way that something like the Lacus or the Alcibiades even, or the Theagus, they're a smaller chunk of subjects discussed. So Protagoras has a myth that Protagoras gives us, but at the beginning of the dialogue instead of the end. And then there's even a discussion of Socrates' views on interpreting poetry. And the whole dialogue takes place in almost like, well, it's a private home, but it also feels like an amphitheater because so many of the pre-Socratics or the sophists are also present. So you get to hear from Protagoras, who is an interesting person that Socrates often cites as somebody who cares about definitions and the precise meaning of words. And then you also get to meet all of these different wide range of people at Callias's house, who is a very, very wealthy man in ancient Athens, and also one of the most unjust. I won't go into the details, but I think he was married to someone, and then he slept with a daughter, and then the wife committed suicide. It's that level of of really intense backstory that's present to all of this. So it's one of the most interesting dramatic setups. But then you're there for several hours, and at the end of it, Protagoras kind of says, "Well, Socrates, I can't say that I agree with how this argument came out, but you'll probably want to be one of the more famous people in the world, you know, maybe. So, it's interesting because in the Gorgias, which is sort of a parallel dialogue where you talk to a rhetorician, the Protagoras, you talk to a sophist, but in the Gorgias, the combative element is very present, but you get more of sort of a persuasive argument morally. He tries to talk Callicles out of a life lived solely for pleasure, a life devoted to intemperance. And there's something more directly emotionally satisfying about it. He is aiming at the noble in this dialogue, whereas the Protagoras, you maybe get more from the sophist himself and get to sort of see what sophistry is really about for this particular guy, Protagoras, but you just don't get the same payoff. So one of my questions is, why is that? Why is Socrates' defeat of the sophist less satisfying than his defeat of the rhetorician? I think the contrast between sophistry and rhetoric is really interesting, and that's one of the things that makes Plato most relevant to our current thinking about what politics is and what constitutes good political speaking. So for Socrates, in the Gorgias, he thinks of both sophistry and rhetoric as a way of flattering us, as a way of lying to us in order to give us pleasure, and giving us speeches and words that sort of like flatter us in a way that we're convinced that what we already think is basically what's true, and it gives us a kind of like self-satisfied pleasure to believe that it would be the case. But they are fundamentally different still for Socrates. What happens is that rhetoric turns out to be associated with law court justice. It's a kind of persuasive, flattering speech that will win you a court case in a specific situation, or persuade a specific audience that you're in the right about this issue. Whereas sophistry for Socrates is interestingly more complicated, and this is particularly what I'm interested in the Protagoras. Sophistry is something that imitates not momentary persuasion, but a kind of persuasion that gets into our bones. Socrates describes it as something that is comparable to the legislative art, something that frames fundamental laws for a constitution, a commonality that's shared by people, something that structures our entire relationship to each other and to where we believe our community is headed, what we want out of this community. So sophistry is all-encompassing, but it is still a kind of flattery. And for Plato, it is always a kind of seeming without a being. It tricks us into thinking that we have an image of what's true and that the image is good enough, and that we don't need to seek for some kind of further knowledge, but we should be content for various reasons that our image of what's basically kind of true is enough for us to win power, to win acclaim within a community or a city more broadly. So for Socrates, these are as close as he gets to having real enemies. Over the course of his career, he continually comes back to thinking about Gorgias and Protagoras as people that he's really fighting with in some way. And this will be a question for us as readers. Is it a fair fight? Is a fight the best way to characterize this? Is Socrates being fair when he attacks these different people for their positions? But ultimately, Socrates does try to give us a very, very, very sharp line between what the practice of philosophy is and what sophistry would be. Sophistry is about finding an image of what's true so that you can gain power and reputation in the city. And philosophy is trying to find what lies beneath the image, what is really true, what really exists, and what goes beyond what's flattering to us. It will bother us. It will say unflattering things about us. It'll say things that disagree with our origins, our basic instincts, our sense of where we're coming from, no matter what side or community we believe ourselves to be part of. This is a very difficult ask because most people at this point would say, you know what, that's okay. I don't need the philosophy. I'll just take the image because the image flatters what I already believe. And so Socrates is one of the best people who can articulate, though, that maybe we should pause and be willing to put up with a little bit more discomfort than we thought when we walked into this philosophical situation, and see what it would really take to be more truthful about what really is the case in relationship to the law courts, with respect to legislative justice. Distributive justice would be the way that Aristotle describes this. So it's a difficult task, but this is something that I know that students really enjoy being challenged by. Sometimes people say that they're willing to put up with images, but I think the students that I am looking for know that at least it's worth asking, what is there that lies beneath this image? What is there that is more true about the nature of justice and the nature of education than simply what lies on the surface? For Socrates, education is what makes the difference for souls, for our lives, and for our cities and our relationship to them. He claims in the Euthyphro, it is the most important thing that we should all be looking to in any civic situation. Education is always the foundation of the next generation and their relationship to knowledge and their willingness to carry on a kind of a commitment to truth and justice that if we did not have the next generation for, we would just be left in the dust. And Socrates claims that most people maybe see some of the importance of education, but they stop short. They find that education is for something else, that it's for credentials or for advancement or for admission or for ambition, or for really just a stepping stone to success or power. And this is a constant theme of all Plato's dialogues. So what Socrates is always trying to do is, without answering this question, ask us what real education would be. What would be better than simply fighting? What would be better than simply fighting about images? What would be better than seeking power for ourselves? What would real learning look like? And so trying to really ask ourselves what that would look like for us is one of the things that the dialogues most of all push us to do. Partly, one of the biggest differences that's stressed again and again in Plato is that the rhetoricians and the sophists take money for what they teach. That straightforwardly, they are in a reciprocal relationship with the student. The student wants some kind of success or power, or some kind of power with words that will allow him to win a law case or convince people that a new law is necessary. And for that, they charge a fee, and then you pay the fee, and then everything's fine. So they agree on that. They agree that that's a perfectly reasonable way to do cash for power. Whereas what Socrates is doing is fundamentally different. First of all, because practically he never takes money for his teaching. He says in the Apology that he is thoroughly poor in all kinds of difficulties because of his refusal to be paid for what he does. But also what happens is when you let money go, when you let your own sort of professional advancement go to the side, you become committed to the idea for the idea's sake. Socrates says again and again that I really am just asking you these questions because I want to know what is good. And to the extent that we can believe that he really means that and that we really trust him, that his life is committed to no money, no power, just for real, asking again in this situation, what is good? That's the extent that we can start to see what goodness would be, apart from any kind of standing, money, or that we'd otherwise be looking. One of the things that Socrates runs into when he tries to talk to these ambitious young people who are trying to decide whether they want to follow the path of rhetoric and sophistry or try to follow a path of philosophy instead is that consistently one thing that underlies their ambition is a relationship to pleasure. They really seem to think that one of the most important things that you should aim at and a sign of your success would be pleasant things. And by this, they mean luxury, luxuries of food, of sex, of all kinds of beautiful houses. And to the extent that Callicles in the Gorgias says that you should take the part of you that wants pleasure and feed it with so much pleasure that you're almost choking, and you enlarge your ability to look for these pleasures. And that's power. That's what makes a personality strong, is Callicles' claim in the Gorgias. So Socrates strongly disagrees. He really, really seems to think that if you really think that pleasure is the highest good for a human life, you will be miserable, first of all. It simply won't work. And then also you will be missing something of the beautiful, the noble, the good, and also the just. So I see that as fundamental to so many Socratic conversations. But so in the Protagoras, something slightly different happens. I think Socrates is still aware that that fundamental problem with pleasure is real. But one of his paths to convincing Protagoras that he does not actually know what virtue is and therefore can't really be, he can't legitimately claim to teach it and therefore be paid for it and have the kind of fame that he claims to have, is that Protagoras thinks that pleasure is what's good. And so when you take the example of courage is a kind of virtue that troubles that claim that pleasure is simply what we are always aiming for. Protagoras, for his reputation as a teacher of these young people, has to claim that courage is a real virtue. But it does look like he admits that people can be courageous and still be kind of foolish and actually even stupid, is the strong adjective that he is willing to use. But so Socrates tries to point out that maybe courage is different. Maybe courage is willing to put up with pains. Maybe courage is not related to pleasure in the same way that some of the other virtues can be sort of manipulated into. So what Socrates does, and this is something that I'm looking forward to discussing with people because I think the mechanics of it are a little odd. There's something funny about it that I'd like to pin down. Socrates says, look, if you follow pleasure as a good, you can't claim that courage is the kind of virtue that you say it is. So he shows himself to be missing a fundamental relationship to what we ordinarily think of as virtue, and something that would be worthwhile to learn from him. If sophistry can't explain courage or even represent it, then is it really the political art that we're looking for? That's how I see the basic outlines of the question. I think my sense of the details is weird enough that I can't quite. There was the last time I worked on this dialogue, I knew that there's something that's missing about that relationship of virtue to courage that I look forward to figuring out. That's a great question. And I think, first of all, I will say that ambition can and is a very good thing. If we lacked some kind of desire for more than we already are, we would fall short of virtue in this ancient sense. We need to be ambitious for ourselves. And so many of the people that Socrates is talking to, they know that they want more for themselves, but they don't know yet what that really constitutes, what that really would be. And so allowing yourself to be in this space where you can interrogate what you really want, what would really satisfy your desire for more, is it simply power? Is it simply success? Is it simply a certain facility with words that will be impressive and you can probably win debates? Those are all interesting qualities that are not necessarily any of them completely bad. But for Socrates, what he wants to draw out of the interlocutor and what Plato wants to draw out of readers is a desire for something a little bit more even than that. That there really does exist something more than simply the operations of power. And there really do exist more than just the images of what's true. We really can see a little bit more of what the nature of ourselves is. We can see more about what the nature of politics is. And if we get stuck in our ambition with just sort of mid-range, oh, you can be sort of successful, it's fine, you will fall short of some of the most satisfying, true things that are possible for the human being to see. So what Socrates offers, I think, the ambitious student is a chance to be ambitious for what's really good. And to sort of question and be in the middle space about, like, what actually is that? Sometimes I tell my students, like, look, there are many characters in Plato who argue that injustice is what's best and that power is what's best. That's really the final reality. People who talk about justice and goodness are really just making it up or lying. And you know what? If that's true, then we should live by that. But I don't think it's true. I think if you look into the heart of what we really want, we do want something more than that. And Plato, I think, is one of the best authors, absolutely, in all of human history, who can talk us through that moment and allow us to see a little bit more of what is actually good. When I was first studying Plato, studying the Republic in particular, I had the good fortune to be a student in Eva Brand's freshman seminar at St. John's in Annapolis back in the day. And I thought I was interested in history and politics when I came in as a freshman because I thought they were the most intellectual things I had run across. I thought, like, these are the people who are talking about something that matters, that is real, that affects all of our lives. And it's fascinating to know something that is so powerful in the thought that it affects and shapes, like, the structure of how we all interact with each other. And so reading the Republic, it starts off with this question of, what is justice? That sounds great. You're going to learn what justice is. And then you get an extraordinarily unsatisfying analogy between the individual and the city. And it just gets worse from there. And then it turns out that if you really want to know about politics, you have to know about metaphysics instead. Or first of all, primarily. And I remember seeing that and thinking, like, first of all, I don't understand what this book is about. And second of all, like, politics seems way too complicated for me to ever understand. And then I thought, well, this metaphysics, does it even exist? But if that's what I really need to know, if it's about unchanging things, then maybe I should take a look at this instead. Maybe that's what I really wanted to know. And so working on the dialogue, I find, like, being drawn into the Republic over the years, the problem is you really do need to know both. The text, this is true of all dialogues in Plato. The one subject you think you are going into a dialogue to learn about, it will force you to say, oh, there's another thing that's related to it that I have no interest in, that I will now have to learn about in order to learn about the first thing that I thought I cared about. It's true it is true every time. Let's say that. So that's true of the Republic. It was true of my sort of progress through Plato. And I have a confidence that it can be true for the Protagoras. My guess right now, which I will alter as the class takes place, is that the forms seem to be absent. Some kind of metaphysics seems to be absent from Protagoras largely. I think that is true. And one of my questions is, why is Socrates not willing? Or why does Socrates think that the forms or metaphysics will not be persuasive in that context, in that company of people? It's fascinating because ordinarily Socrates just brings that argument up again and again, but for some reason, and I would like to check this for myself just to make sure, I'm going to have to go and look up the word in Perseus just to make sure it does not arise. But it seems that whatever the combat with the sophist is, it doesn't seem right to Socrates at that moment to sort of combat sophistry directly with metaphysics. That would be my rough guess. So Protagoras tries to make a myth of the origins of the whole cosmos and where law and justice and politics come from. And so he has to sort of involve the gods and try to sort of give a cosmic relationship to how all these things are situated. So it does tease us with a kind of a cosmic understanding of, like, where do these things first come from? What is the origin of mankind? So it does definitely touch on those questions. We will have to see if Protagoras' myth is satisfying or if he's left something very crucial out. It immediately runs into much more human situations where he says, in fact, so easy it is to know and teach virtue that everyone knows it and everyone teaches it, which we'll just see if we think that is true. Yeah, this is a good question because I am on the fence about how history and our sort of, like, our classical knowledge of, like, the fine-tuned details, how necessary they are for, like, your fairly early learning with respect to Plato. I love details like this. I spend so much happy time, like reading books of history, books about mythology, like architectural details from ancient Athens. So interesting, so fascinating. So interesting to see the methodology that goes into that. I find on the whole that really the barest beginning of a sense of the ancient Greeks lived and flourished. We typically are interested in the 400s and the 500s and the 300s BC. But too much historical detail will kind of spoil your ability to see the details of the text. In general, Plato gives you the information within the text itself that he considers to be fully relevant. So each dialogue forms a kind of a perfect literary and also philosophical whole. There's this principle of logographic necessity that he discusses in the Phaedrus, where each word is important and each word has to be right in order for the whole to be whole. So if Plato is doing his job, the dialogues he is giving us are like that. They contain the information we need. However, also, they are written in such a beautifully novelistic fashion that there are these intense backstories to all these different characters that it's fun to learn about, and they do enrich our understanding of the text. I think my advice for the first-time reader of the Protagoras would be to read the dialogue first. Our footnotes in our edition are actually reasonable for giving you some basic background, but not too much. And then I can give a little, but I have found I personally love the history so much that I'm very always tempted to give people all this backstory and these interesting details, and then I find that it's just not that helpful. It tends not to be as helpful for the student, and it really, really can distract even the expert from what's really